What is up, you guys? This is All Day 1 on the PS4, and I'm going to be giving you a video on the monk's rotation and abilities. So this rotation isn't necessarily like the all-knowing and the best rotation in the world. It's just like a basic rotation, something that you can kind of learn and then build off from, so you kind of get somewhat of an understanding of the monk. The monk is definitely one of the more complex classes to play as well when it comes to rotations, but the abilities are all pretty simple. So let's go ahead and take a look at the abilities. Oh, and by the way, the reason why I'm not in the combat center or the training center is because the little ads, the little minion robots, die in like 1 or 2 hits. So I just decided to come to Lunar Swamps because it's better, it's easier to show examples of how some of these abilities can work. So you have 3 stances. You have the Earth stance, Fire stance, and Wind stance. Earth stance, so we're not going to take a look really at the square because it's just basic, 2 basic hits, but we're going to look at the other combos. So the Earth stance, you have Dragon Strike, Falling Mountain, and Lotus Strike. And then you've got Aggressive Lunge, and you've got Stone Palm. So Aggressive Lunge and Stone Palm are your 2 abilities that you have cooldown. So you have a 30-second cooldown and 20-second cooldown. Dragon Strike, it says inflicts 3.58 million damage to the enemy stuns for 4 seconds if the monk is affected by power of Earth. Falling Mountain inflicts 6.95 million damage to the enemy. Falling Mountain inflicts 40% more damage to targets with less than 30% health. Lotus Strike inflicts 6.06 million damage to the enemy if the target or if the monk is affected by power of Earth. The attack will knock the target back. When that happens, the target takes additional 3.03 million damage, knocks back and stuns the nearby enemies, inflicting 7.27 million damage to them. Inflicts 200% more damage to shields. If the target of Lotus Strike hits a stationary obstacle, that when they get thrown, they will take 23.8 million damage and become stunned for 3 seconds. Lotus Strike deals 50% more damage to targets with more than 30% health. And then with Aggressive Lunge, it's 20-second cooldown. The monk lunges forward with their staff, pushing the enemies back and knocking them down for 4 seconds. Stone Palm, 30-second cooldown, inflicts 29.8 million damage to the enemy. And then so I don't really use the Earth stance too much in PvE. PvP, this is actually going to be super useful in a lot of ways just because of the knockbacks and stuns that you can apply with Earth stance. But it is also a really good single target ability though, especially like on bosses, elites, etc. The reason why is because of this stance is the only stance that should do more damage to enemies with less than a certain amount of health. Although Fire stance lets you do a lot of damage to enemies that are slowed and slowed and some other status effect that I can't recall right now. But yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and look at the Fire stance. So you have Scorching Strike, attacks surrounding enemies for 4 seconds, inflicting 14.6 million damage. The damage against slowed down and immobilized characters is increased by 150%. And then Dragon Rage inflicts 7.43 million damage to enemies in front of the monk. If the monk is affected by Rage of Fire, Dragon Rage will stun the ordinary enemies. The damage against slowed down and immobilized characters is increased by 150%. Dragon Rage removes effects caused by Earth attacks that inflict damage over time, inflicting the damage they would otherwise have dealt, as well as additional 70% of the damage. And then you have Spiral Attack, inflicts 7.3 million damage to enemies in a 10-yard radius. Spiral Attack inflicts 65% more damage to enemies with more than 50% health. So regardless, you can either use Spiral Attack or Dragon Rage. You can probably just mix it both up if you'd like to, just to make it look more flashy, more better. But Dragon Rage is what you're going to want to use first normally. I'll go ahead and explain the small rotation a little later, but like I said, it does more damage to enemies that are slowed and immobilized by 150% more. And it says Dragon Rage removes earth effects, yada yada yada, inflicting the damage they would otherwise have dealt, as well as additional 7% of damage. So I'm guessing when it wipes off the effects from the earth stance, it inflicts 70% more damage plus whatever it was going to do. I never really noticed too much, so I didn't really pay attention to it, so I can't really tell you how that works. But yeah, so the fire stance is going to synergize pretty well with the wind stance, though. And then you have your two abilities, 30-second cooldown and 20-second cooldown. Heart of a Phoenix. So 30-second cooldown applies an effect to the monk, which inflicts damage to nearby enemies every second for 3 seconds. The attack inflicts 6.88 million damage in total. This damage will be increased for each opponent next to the monk, up to 20.6 million for 3 enemies. Burning Staff is a 20-second cooldown. The monk hits the ground with a Burning Staff, inflicting 5.96 million damage to enemies. If the monk is surrounded by 3 or more enemies, the monk begins burning, and then Burning Ground inflicts additional 22.5 million damage to enemies for 7 seconds. So Heart of a Phoenix is going to do damage over time regardless to how many enemies there are. It's just that the more enemies that are around you, the more damage you'll do. So if you have 3 or more enemies, the more damage you'll inflict to those enemies with the damage over time. Burning Staff, you can only apply the ground on fire when there's 3 or more enemies around you. When there's only 1 or 2 enemies, it's not going to do damage over time. It'll just do an additional initial burst damage to the enemies. And then you have the wind stance. So you have Return Wave, pulls all enemies to the spot where the monk stood a moment ago. If the monk is affected by elusiveness of wind, it will also reduce the movement speed of the enemies by 95% for 7 seconds. And then you have Enraged Harpy, inflicts 7.23 million damage to the target. If the monk is affected by elusiveness of wind, the target is shifted along the direction of the strike. And then Gust of Wind knocks the monk and the target away from each other, inflicting 11.1 million damage. Activates Impulse Charge. If the elusiveness of wind effect is active, the monk will be invulnerable for the duration of the fight. Does not cancel the elusiveness of wind effect. So what I normally do is whenever there's multiple enemies, I always use Return Wave as kind of like a starting ability. Not necessarily my starting ability, but it's just the starting combo that I use before I start switching my stances. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the abilities. So you have Rapid Stream. So moves towards the target and inflicts 5.91 million damage. If the target is 15 yards or farther away, the cooldown of the stance is reset. If the monk is affected by elusiveness of wind, the damage is increased in proportion to the damage or the distance between the monk and the target. At 15 yards, the damage is 14.8 million damage. Activates Impulse Charge. The damage is increased by 100% when Impulse Charge is activated. When used 15 or more yards away, first Rapid Stream used during the elusiveness of wind gives the monk a shield that absorbs damage equal to 25% of their health. Lasts for 7 seconds. So I only use this to get the shield absorption, or the absorb damage shield, or whatever you want to call it, just the shield. So whenever I start combat, I always use Rapid Stream first, or I use Windcatcher, either or. But Rapid Stream you always want to use when you're at least 15 yards away or more. You don't want to use it when you're right up on the enemies. And then you have Windcatcher. It's a 40-second cooldown. Increases the monk's movement speed by 30% for 12 seconds. Increases dash distance 3 times and makes the monk immune to immobilizing and slowing effects. So we're going to look at the talents. We have Cyclone. Monk's special techniques make them stronger when they switch between stances in battle, and Cyclone is just one of those. For each killed enemy, the monk gains the Cyclone effect that lasts 90 seconds and stacks up to 14 times. So the beginning of the fight, the monk gains 1 vortex effect for 1 level of Cyclone. For each level of Cyclone, the damage of the next falling mountain, Dragon Rage, and Enraged Harpy is increased by 20%, stacking all the way up to 280%. And then you have Stone Palm, which is increased by 10%, and which would be 140% in total. Vortex stacks up to 14 times. Strong Will, it changes what Windcatcher's original perk does. Windcatcher no longer protects the monk against control effects, but instead applies 14 levels of Vortex to them. For each level of Vortex, the damage of the next Falling Mountain, Dragon Rage, and Enraged Harpy is increased by 20%, and Stone Palm by 10%. Vortex stacks up to 14 times. So normally, once you're at a boss fight and you don't have Cyclone active anymore, Windcatcher is going to be not amazing, it's going to be a very useful ability to use due to the fact that you're going to be getting those 14 stacks of the Vortex for what, 7 seconds? I believe it was 7 seconds. Oh, 90 seconds. I'm not exactly sure how long the Windcatcher lasts for, but it's 12 seconds. But yeah, so you'll get the Vortex to stack up 14 times, and Windcatcher will also increase your movement speed. So what you would want to do is you would want to use Rapid Stream and then Windcatcher, or Windcatcher then Rapid Stream. As long as you're using one or the other, or you're using both. You don't have to use it exactly at the same time, but you're using both before you start using your combos. So for instance, let's say, this is gonna be how I do my rotation. So Rapid Stream, then Windcatcher, and as soon as you're at your enemies, you're going to use Return Wave, which is going to pull all the enemies and make them slow. Then you're going to go ahead and switch to Fire Stance, and then you're going to use either, before you use those, you want to use Triangle, then Circle. So you're going to use Heart of a Phoenix, then you're going to use Burning Staff. And then you can either go with Scorching Strike or Dragon Rage. And then you can also choose to go with Spiral Attack, but I probably wouldn't yet, just because of the fact that Dragon Rage, I would go with Dragon Rage first, just because of the fact that you have Vortex active. If Vortex was not active, then Scorching Strike would work, because the enemies are slowed down and immobilized, or slowed down, not immobilized. And then if they aren't slowed down, then Spiral Attack would be the better option. So like I said, with this rotation, you're going to use Triangle, then Circle. So you're going to use Rapid Stream, then Windcatcher, and then as soon as you're at the enemy and there's multiple enemies, Return Wave. And after that, you're going to go ahead and use Dragon Rage all the way up for, I don't know, maybe until the enemy is about 50% health. And depending on how many enemies are there, if it's a lot of enemies, you're just going to stick with Fire Stance. Remember to make sure you do pop Heart of a Phoenix and Burning Staff. So you're going to do those, and then you would use Dragon Rage. But like I said, if there's maybe 3 enemies or less, then that's when you're going to start wanting to use Falling Mountain to take the enemies out one by one when they have less than 30% health. If they don't have less than 30% health, then just stick with Dragon Rage. But if it's just like minion and type of enemies, you shouldn't have much of a problem just using Dragon Rage, Scorching Strike, or Spiral Attack on them. Earth Stance, generally you would want to use this on the single target enemies, bosses or elites, just because, I mean, it's stronger against single targets versus a bunch of ads. So I'm going to go ahead and show you against these enemies right here. So I'm going to use Triangle, then Circle, and then I'm going to hit, as soon as I'm close to all of them, I'm going to use Square, Triangle. So that way you get that combo to pull all the enemies in. And then I'm going to switch to my Fire Stance, and I'm going to use Triangle and Circle to apply damage over time and just keep spamming Square. So I'm not going to worry about using my Earth Stance at all for this fight right here. So I'm going to hit them, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull, and then drop their damage over time. Watch out from that. And that right there is just a small little combo against multiple enemies right there. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to these enemies. Now I don't have my Windcatcher anymore, so I'm going to have to go without Windcatcher. Oh. So this is without Windcatcher. Okay. That was a little annoying. I'm going to have to do that again. So now I'm going to go ahead and try to pull all the enemies. apply damage over time. And there you go with that group of enemies right there. And then we're going to do it with, what is this, 4 enemies over here. So I'm going to go ahead and apply Wind Catcher, run to the enemy, and then drop damage over time. Oh, I forgot to apply the pool. I need to pull the enemies. That's why the damage over time didn't go off, because I didn't have enough enemies on me. So that's why that pooling ability is going to be really important to have, because if you don't have the pool, then you're not going to be able to get the damage over time to go off. Now we're going to go ahead and try this on the boss. Now when you're, like I said, when you're fighting enemies that are less than 3 enemies, the damage over time for the fire stance with circle is not going to work. You can use the triangle, it'll still apply damage over time for a few seconds, but it's just not going to be as strong. But everything else is still going to be the same. So you're going to use the wind stance, so you're going to use those first 2 abilities, but you do not have to worry about using square triangle or X and Y combo, because you cannot slow or immobilize the boss. So I'm going to go ahead and use that, and then once you use those 2 abilities, triangle and circle, you're going to switch to your fire stance, and then go ahead and use I believe it's square square triangle multiple times, because that's going to do 65% more damage to the enemies that have more 50% health or more. So here we go. Make sure you apply that damage over time as well. Oh, and as you can see, I still have Cyclone and Vortex actually on the bottom of my screen, so using square, 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 or X, X, X is still going to help a lot. Apply that damage over time again. And then if you need to, back up and then use triangle, so that way you can apply your shield on yourself again. Oh, I just got rammed. Whoops. And then make sure you look at your other stances, so that way you know if your not elusiveness, your wind abilities are done with their cooldown. And then I'm going to go ahead and switch to the earth stance. Ooh. So, like I said, with the earth stance, it's better when you're... Oh, I got stuck by the light pole. But with the earth stance, it's better when you're fighting bosses, so that way you can dish out more damage to them. But with the triple square or triple X, you're not going to use that, or you can use that regardless, but you would only really use that when the enemies have less than 30% health. So I'm going to just go ahead and look at all these abilities again, kind of like a little recap, just on how I go with the rotations again. So I go with square, circle, or circle and square first, so that way you apply the vortex, and then you can also get that shield from rapid stream. And then you're going to use return wave. Return wave is going to be very important to use when you're fighting a group of enemies. And then after that, you're going to switch to the fire stance, Heart of a Phoenix, and you're going to use Burning Staff to apply damage over time. And then you're going to just start spamming Dragon Rage while you have Vortex active. And this is only for the lower enemies, the minions. Now if you're going against bosses, you're going to still go with the same thing. You're going to use Rapid Stream and Wind Catcher. Don't worry about Return Wave unless you have other nearby enemies around you. Then you can, I guess you can use Return Wave. But if you don't, if it's just a one-on-one, don't use Return Wave, because you cannot apply the slow or immobilize to enemies or bosses. So you're going to use, like I said, triangle, circle, and then go to fire stance, and use triangle with fire stance, Heart of a Phoenix, just because of the fact that you still apply damage over time for 3 seconds, so that'll still be good enough. And then after that, you're going to go ahead and start spamming Dragon Rage while you have Vortex active, And then once your vortex runs out, which you'll know when you look at the bottom left corner of the screen, the tornado symbol is going to disappear. Then you're going to start wanting to use spiral attack, because you're doing 65% more damage to enemies with 50% health or more. And then once they get down to that 30% or 40% mark of health, I believe it's 40%. Yeah, so once they are at the 40% health left, you're going to start wanting to use the Falling Mountain ability, which is triple square or triple X if you're on Xbox. That way you're going to start doing 40% more damage to the single target enemies. And then with the pace of a crane, you only would want to use this if you really have to. You don't necessarily, I don't really use this too much in PvE unless there's too many enemies on me and I need to escape or something. But other than that, I don't really use pace of a crane too much. And I don't really use fusion strike either that much, so I don't really know when the best option to use fusion strike would be. On maybe on just the boss, obviously would be on the boss, but I still have yet to actually use it. But yeah, that's pretty much it though with this video, with this sort of monk rotation guide. If this video helped you at all, go and leave a like, comment, subscribe. I know this is kind of a long video. It's just because of the fact that the monk is pretty complex, so I wanted to be sure that you guys kind of understand the rotation that I go with and how it kind of works for me. You guys you don't necessarily have to follow this rotation. This, like I said, this is kind of like a beginner's type rotation. It isn't like something for super advanced players that already know how to play the monk. This is just for those of you that just got the monk and are kind of confused with how to playing the monk. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So like I said, if this video helped you out, go leave a like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know down in the comment section. I know a lot of you guys were waiting for the monk rotation ability guide, so here you go. And yeah, so this is All Day Day 1 on the PS4. Have a good day, good night, and peace.